The underlying reason is that gender ideology is an assault on truth. And truth matters for its own sake. There's an inherent value to truth. And when something threatens truth, or not, you can't really, truth is truth. You can't threaten it, you can't do anything about it. But when something threatens to such a degree, threatens our ability to perceive and understand truth on a collective level, then that's enough reason to consider it a grave threat to civilization. And I use the comparison all the time that what if there was a movement out there gaining steam to convince everyone that squares are circles? There's a spectrum of squareness and circleness, and really they're the same in the end, or whatever. Now, if that was, I don't walk around every day thinking about squares and circles. I don't care that much about geometry. But if this movement was happening, then I'd be out there fighting against it and say, no, squares are squares, circles are circles. Now I care because this is a basic truth of reality that you are waging assault against. And I don't want to live in a world where we don't know the difference between squares and circles. And then, not to go too far with this analogy, but at first it becomes this abstract matter of truth. Okay, but then if you actually abandon this truth and say, oh, it doesn't matter, squares are circles and circles are squares, then you start to see the real practical implications. Yes. Because how do you have, how do you build anything? How do you have architecture in a world where no one understands geometry, right? Next thing you know, buildings are collapsing on people's heads. So once you abandon truth, from there are all these enormously horrific consequences. Yeah. Going back to gender, that's what we see. First, it's the abandonment of truth. Consequence of that, women lose their identities, really. Their identities are appropriated. They lose their privacy. They lose their rights. Children are victimized. But that all grows from this kind of root of abandoning truth.
Yeah, absolutely. I think following on from that as well, something that I think is deeply concerning about it, two things actually. Number one is that it sets a very dangerous precedent because there's not really a more fundamental and self-evident and obvious truth as the fact that there are men and women, boys and girls, and that males and females are different and always have been in all across species. It's literally how we all got here. Everyone birthed on this planet was birthed from a woman. And if you can convince millions or billions of people that that is not the case, then you can convince them of anything, right? There are many, many things that would fall out from that. And another point of it, which is you brought up the issue with kids, and you talked about this in your documentary, but a point that I haven't seen many people make, and maybe because it's very uncomfortable, but to me it's a very obvious gateway to pedophilia. Because if people are advocating that an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old, a 12-year-old, whatever, can consent to a gender transition and something that will permanently alter them, perhaps render them infertile for the rest of their life, you're saying that you can make that decision at 12, then you are also crushing the argument against children not being able to consent to sexual activity. You don't let kids get tattoos. You don't let them drive. You don't I think tattoos are actually a great example because that's something that's permanent. I'd say a 12-year-old getting a tattoo is less concerning than them going on hormone therapy or having their genitals removed or anything like that. So I think it's a very, and especially knowing the history of the type of people who initially pushed this type of gender ideology and some of their methods and things that they did, to me it's like this is a very clear, you're opening a Pandora's, very, very dangerous Pandora's box here. And I don't even know if the activists themselves realize that or the people advocating it, but it's a point that I don't think gets brought up much. But I think that's a real danger of it as well.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. It's not far-fetched. It's not a conspiracy theory. As you said, there's a logical end to this because the whole argument against pedophilia, against a relationship between an adult and a child. And the reason we say it's not a relationship, that's impossible. It's rape. Yeah. Even if the child, consents verbally, it's not really consent because. And why is that? These are what we say, and we all pretend to agree anyway. why is that? It's because a child can, no matter what they say, no matter what the child even feels allegedly, the child cannot consent, cannot, because of the lack of mental formation, the lack of psychological and neurological development. I mean, there's real science behind this also, by the way. The prefrontal cortex, which controls our discernment, long-term decision making, that's not fully developed until we're 25. So, take an 8 or 9-year-old. How far along are they developed in that department? Like, hardly at all. And that's why little kids just have they do stupid, impulsive things, and we have to constantly control them because they're not thinking about. They literally can't even conceive of like what's tomorrow going to be like. So that's all. That's what all this is built on is on this idea that kids cannot make these kinds of decisions for themselves. And as you point out, if you take that away and you say, oh, well, actually, kids can. Not only can they make these kinds of long-term decisions for themselves, but they can make what are essentially sexual decisions for themselves. So it's not just any decision. It's not just getting a tattoo. As you point out, that would be a lot better than doing a gender transition. I'd prefer that. No, they're making sexual decisions, and it's based on this idea also that they are like in touch with their own sexuality. And we get into in the film, Alfred Kinsey and his belief that children are sexual from birth. And he went to extreme extents and horrific extents to prove this theory of his. Yeah. So all of that is wrapped together with this gender ideology stuff. You're sexualizing kids. You're claiming that they are able to consent to profound life-altering decisions. And if that's the case, then it's not hard to see how all this other stuff gets ushered in.